1 million years ago, somewhere in what is now South Africa, a human ate something that had been sitting next to a fire. Not cooked deliberately, not prepared with any intention, just food that happened to be close enough to heat that it changed before someone ate it. That accident did not feel like an invention. It felt like food that tasted different, that was easier to chew, that sat differently in the stomach. And whoever ate it filed that observation with the same precision that their survival depended on applying to every observation about the world around them. What happened next took thousands of years. It was not a single moment of discovery. It was a slow accumulation of accidental encounters, deliberate repetitions of those accidents, and eventually the intentional application of a principle that nobody could have articulated, but that every human group on Earth eventually arrived at independently. And the endpoint of that accumulation was not just a cooking technique. It was a different species. Biologically, neurologically, anatomically, different from the one that had been eating everything raw for the 2 million years before it. You are the endpoint. And the accident that started the chain is stranger, more specific, and more consequential than anything your school curriculum prepared you to understand. The accidental cooking hypothesis requires understanding what the world around early human fires actually looked like. Because the popular image of a deliberate campfire with food intentionally placed above it misrepresents the sequence entirely. For hundreds of thousands of years before cooking, fire was managed for warmth and protection. The evidence from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, published by Francesco Berna and colleagues in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012, places controlled fire use at approximately 1 million years ago. The fire at Wonderwork was not a cooking fire. It was a safety perimeter and a heat source. The food that early humans ate was gathered, scavenged, and consumed at the location of acquisition, or carried back to the group and eaten raw. But the relationship between food and fire in a managed camp creates accidental cooking opportunities with a frequency that the deliberate invention narrative completely misses. Tubers stored near the fire for carrying are exposed to radiant heat over hours. Animal fat dripped from a carcass being butchered near the fire hits hot stones and renders. Seeds stored in organic containers set too close to the embers begin to roast. These are not controlled cooking events. They are the inevitable consequences of keeping food in proximity to a heat source over the extended periods that camp life imposed. The critical observation, the one that eventually became deliberate cooking, was not that the food was hot. It was that the food was different, easier to chew, different in flavor, different in the way the stomach responded to it, and different in a direction that the human digestive system responded to, with signals that the conscious mind could not have interpreted as preference, but that the body registered with every feedback mechanism it possessed. The chemistry underneath that difference is where the accident reveals its full biological significance. And it is more fundamental than most people realize. Raw starch granules are crystalline structures that human digestive enzymes cannot efficiently penetrate. The amylase in human saliva begins breaking starch down, but the process is slow and incomplete for raw starch, leaving a significant proportion of the caloric content of raw tubers, grains, and roots inaccessible to absorption. Heat disrupts the crystalline structure of starch in a process called gelatinization. The granules absorb water, swell, and rupture, exposing the glucose chains inside to enzymatic attack with dramatically greater efficiency. The caloric yield from a cooked tuber is not marginally higher than from a raw one. It is substantially higher. Estimates from experimental studies published by researchers, including Richard Wrangham at Harvard in his analysis of cooking energetics, place the differential at approximately 30 to 50% more bioavailable calories from cooked versus raw starch sources. Protein denaturation is the parallel process in animal tissue. Raw protein molecules are folded into complex three-dimensional structures that digestive enzymes must unfold before they can cleave the peptide bonds. Heat denatures these structures, unfolding the proteins and exposing the peptide bonds directly to enzymatic attack. The result is faster digestion, higher protein absorption efficiency, and reduced energy expenditure by the digestive system processing the food. The gut does less work. More of the work has already been done by the fire. The human body responded to these efficiencies with signals that were not pleasure in any abstract sense. They were the concrete physiological feedback of a digestive system encountering food that was metabolically easier to process than anything it had previously received. Reduced digestive discomfort, faster satiety signals, higher sustained energy from the same caloric input. The body of the early human who accidentally ate cooked food was not experiencing culinary preference. It was experiencing a metabolic windfall. In the repetition of that experience, the deliberate seeking of cooked food, once the pattern was recognized, was not a cultural choice. It was a biological imperative expressed through preference. The specific accident that most likely produced the first recognized cooking event was not a campfire. It was a wildfire. Wildfire in the African savanna is not an occasional disaster. It is a regular ecological feature. The same savanna landscapes where early Homo erectus populations were living between 1.8 and 1 million years ago experienced fire return intervals measured in years, not decades, years. The landscape burned regularly, and the aftermath of a wildfire in a savanna environment produces something that early hominins were well positioned to exploit: roasted tubers. The geophytes, the underground storage organs of savanna plants that constitute one of the most calorie-dense and reliably available food sources in the African grassland environment, survive surface fires intact underground and emerge from the burned soil surface partially or fully cooked by the heat conducted through the ground above them, cooked by accident, by a process that had nothing to do with human intention, and everything to do with the fire ecology of the savanna landscape that early humans inhabited. Andrew Sorensen at Leiden University, whose research on stone tool use wear analysis published in 2021 documented direct evidence of fire-making technology in Neanderthal tools at 50,000 years ago, frames the pre-fire-making period as one in which early humans were fire opportunists rather than fire producers. They did not make fire. They found it, maintained it, and transported it. And in a landscape that generated fire regularly through lightning strikes and the specific combustion characteristics of dry season savanna vegetation, the opportunities to encounter the aftermath of wildfire and exploit its food-modifying effects were not rare. They were a regular feature of the foraging environment. A Homo erectus group moving through a burned savanna in the aftermath of a wildfire was encountering partially cooked tubers, roasted seeds, and occasionally the carcasses of animals killed by the fire and then heated by it as a normal foraging opportunity. The association between fire and changed food was not a laboratory discovery. It was a regular field observation made by beings whose survival depended on precisely tracking the associations between environmental conditions and food quality. The timeline between accidental encounter and deliberate practice is the part that the invention narrative handles most poorly, because it was not a moment, it was a process. And the process operated through mechanisms that are completely invisible in the archaeological record, but completely legible in the biological and behavioral evidence. The first stage was recognition, the association between fire-modified food and the specific quality of metabolic response that fire-modified food produced. This recognition did not require language. It did not require any abstract cognitive framework for understanding what fire was doing to the food. It required only the same associative learning that every social animal capable of generalizing from experience performs continuously. Fire was near the food. The food is different. The difference feels a specific way in the body. Pay attention to this association. The second stage was exploitation, moving toward fire aftermath environments specifically to access the food modification effect, seeking out burned areas after wildfires specifically for the cooked tubers and roasted seeds they contained. This is documented behavior in several non-human animal species that regularly exploit wildfire aftermath for cooked or heat-modified food. Raptors that hunt the edges of active wildfires for fleeing animals represent one form of fire exploitation. The behavior is not unique to humans, but the specific exploitation of cooked plant food in fire aftermath environments may have been. The third stage was the critical one, and it required a cognitive leap that the evidence suggests took hundreds of thousands of years to complete. Not the recognition that fire changes food, not the exploitation of wildfire aftermath, but the deliberate transportation or maintenance of fire for the specific purpose of applying its food-modifying effect to food that was not already in the fire's path. This is the step that converts opportunistic exploitation of an environmental feature into what we would recognize as cooking, and it required holding together two separate chains of association. Fire produces the food effect. I can bring the fire to the food, rather than waiting for the fire to come to the food, into a single intentional act that neither chain alone would generate. Richard Wrangham's cooking hypothesis, published in its most complete form in his 2009 book, Catching Fire: How Cooking Made Us Human, provides the biological framework that makes the accident comprehensible as an evolutionary event, rather than just a dietary shift. The argument is precise and specific in its claims, which is why it has generated the sustained scholarly debate that has produced the most rigorous testing the hypothesis has received. The Homo erectus fossil record shows a suite of anatomical changes relative to the Australopithecines and early Homo that preceded them that are consistent with adaptation to a cooked diet over time. Smaller teeth, weaker jaw muscles, evidenced by reduced temporal muscle attachment areas on the skull, shorter digestive tract relative to body size, inferred from the narrower thoracic cage visible in Homo erectus skeletons, compared to the barrel-chested Australopithecines, whose wider lower thorax accommodated a larger gut, and the expanded brain case that is the most dramatic and most discussed feature of the transition to Homo erectus. The connection between cooking and brain expansion runs through the metabolic trade-off between gut tissue and brain tissue. Both are metabolically expensive. Brain tissue consumes approximately 20% of the body's caloric budget at rest. Gut tissue is also expensive to maintain, requiring continuous energy input to sustain the epithelial turnover and enzymatic production that digestion demands. The expensive tissue hypothesis, proposed by Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler in their 1995 paper in Current Anthropology, argues that the expansion of the expensive brain tissue in the human lineage required a compensating reduction in other expensive tissue. The gut is the candidate, and the reduction in gut size is plausible only if the quality of the diet improved sufficiently to allow the same caloric and nutritional needs to be met with less digestive processing capacity. Cooked food provides that quality improvement: higher caloric bioavailability from the same raw ingredients, faster digestion, reduced pathogen load from heat-killed microorganisms, softer texture, requiring less mechanical processing by teeth and jaw before swallowing. The metabolic argument for cooking as the enabler of brain expansion is not proven to the satisfaction of every researcher in the field. The archaeological evidence for cooking at 1.8 million years ago, the point at which Homo erectus appears with the anatomical suite consistent with Wrangham's hypothesis, remains contested. But the biological logic is tight enough that the debate has shifted from whether cooking could have produced these effects to when the systematic cooking required to produce them actually began. The gap between the earliest evidence of fire use at 1 million years ago and the earliest anatomical evidence of cooking adaptation in Homo erectus at 1.8 million years ago is the gap that the field is currently most actively working to close. And the methods being applied to close it are producing results that the accidental cooking hypothesis predicted, but that nobody had the tools to test until recently. Starch granule analysis on ancient stone tools is one of the approaches producing new evidence. Dolores Piperno at the Smithsonian Institution, whose work on ancient plant use has consistently extended the documented timeline of plant exploitation by early humans, has published analysis of starch residues on stone tools from sites in the Middle East and East Africa, showing heat-modified starch granules dating to periods substantially earlier than the wonderwork cave evidence for controlled fire use. The granules show the gelatinization signatures that heat exposure produces in starch structure. They are on tools that were used to process plant food. And their age pushes the earliest evidence of cooked plant consumption back to time frames that change the relationship between cooking and the Homo erectus anatomical transition from coincidence to possible causation. Dental calculus analysis, the same technique that revealed Neanderthal plant use at El Sidrón Cave in Spain, is producing parallel evidence from early Homo sites for heat-modified plant compounds in dental plaque that survived in the mineralized record. The body of evidence is accumulating in the same direction, earlier than the controlled fire evidence suggests, more widespread than the campfire-centric narrative implies, and more consistent with the opportunistic exploitation of a wildfire aftermath rather than the deliberate fire management that later periods document unambiguously. The social consequences of cooking are the dimension of the accidental invention that Wrangham's hypothesis develops most fully, and that the archaeological evidence supports most clearly in the periods after controlled fire is established. A group that cooks eats together in a way that a group that forages individually does not. Raw food foraging is a distributed activity. Each individual acquires, processes, and consumes food at the location of acquisition or with minimal transportation back to the group. The food is personal. The consumption is individual. The social interaction around food is limited by the fact that there is no particular reason to bring the food back to a central location and no particular reason for the group to be present at the same time and place for consumption. Cooked food changes this structure completely. Fire is a fixed point. You cannot carry it freely to every location where food is acquired. You bring the food to the fire. And when multiple individuals bring food to the same fire and the cooking happens at that central point, the eating happens there too, together, at the same time, in a context where the fire provides light, warmth, and the predator deterrence that makes extended stationary social time viable after dark. The campfire meal is not a cultural institution layered on top of cooking. It is the structural consequence of cooking, the food coming to the fire rather than the fire going to the food. And the social density that the campfire meal creates, the enforced proximity and extended shared time of a group eating together around a central heat source, is the context in which Polly Wiesner's 2014 research documented the shift from practical daytime conversation to the storytelling and cultural transmission that nighttime fire conversation produced. Cooking created the campfire. The campfire created the context for culture. The culture created the species. The accident that started the chain was a tuber sitting too close to a wildfire a million years ago. The end of the chain is every conversation that has ever happened between human beings who chose to sit together around a shared source of heat and light rather than scatter into the dark alone. The human body you're running right now is the accumulated biological response to that accident. expressed across 1,000,000 years of selection for individuals whose anatomy and physiology were optimized for a cooked diet rather than a raw one. Your teeth are too small for efficient raw food processing. Your jaw muscles are too weak to manage the sustained mastication that a raw food diet requires for adequate caloric extraction. Your gut is too short to extract sufficient nutrients from raw plant material without the pre-processing that cooking provides. And your brain is too metabolically expensive to run on the caloric yield that a raw food diet produces without the efficiency gains of cooking. You're not a raw food animal who learned to cook. You're a cooking animal whose biology was shaped by cooking over so many generations that removing cooking from the equation does not return you to some prior natural state. It creates a metabolic mismatch between your digestive capacity and your dietary requirements that produces malnutrition even when raw food is available in abundance. This has been documented in populations who have attempted fully raw diets in modern conditions: chronic caloric deficit, reproductive disruption in women at high rates documented by researchers studying raw food diet, adherence in Germany in a study published by Corinna Kobnik and colleagues in 1999. The biology does not support the diet that preceded the accident that changed it. The accident was irreversible, not because fire could not be extinguished, because the species that the accident eventually produced could not survive without the thing the accident had created. 1,000,000 years of biological adaptation to cooked food produced an animal that required cooked food to function. The dependence is total. The commitment is absolute. And it began with something that nobody planned, nobody understood, and nobody would have recognized as the beginning of the most consequential dietary transition in the history of the primate lineage. A tuber near a fire, food that tasted different, a body that responded to the difference with every feedback mechanism it possessed, and a brain just capable enough of tracking associations between environmental conditions and biological outcomes to remember, the next time the fire was near, to put the food a little closer